Eric Davis,
Here.
Karen Flores,
Here.
Jackie Kellogg,
Here.
Rebecca Pyers.
Here.
Sorry.
Here.
Sean Slauson,
Here.
Amy Zaroya,
Here.
Devonna McLaughlin, Moses Milazzo,
Here.
Russ Schaefer, Glenn Slivers. No. Sandy Flores, Adria Parafinick, Tyler Denham.
Here. All right, thank you everyone for being here today. A few housekeeping reminders to start. This meeting is being recorded. Please avoid using the chat box for general chatter. Instead, enter a C or a Q if you have a comment or question during the meeting. Also, please keep yourselves muted if you're not speaking to avoid audio issues. And if you need to leave the meeting early, please let us know so we can note the time for the meeting minutes and do a quorum check. And with that out of the way, agenda item 3 is the land acknowledgement. Is there any volunteer that would like to read it?
I will read it.
Thank you. Go ahead.
The Housing Commission humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of this area's indigenous nations and original steward. These lands, still inhabited by native descendants, border mountains sacred to indigenous peoples. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home.
Thank you for that, Karen. With that, next is agenda item 4, opening the meeting up to public comment. Adriana, is anyone queued up for public comment, or did we receive any public comment by email?
Not at this time.
Okay, gotcha. In that case, move along to agenda item 5A, the consideration of approval of minutes for the commission meeting on January 26th. I will entertain a motion if someone has one.
I move to approve the minutes.
Okay, and that was
Karen.
all right. So we have a motion from Commissioner Karen and a second from Commissioner Jackie. Is there any discussion? All right, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that motion carries and the minutes are approved. Finally, to the meat of today's agenda, agenda item 6A, funding allocation recommendation to council. And to kick that off, we have a presentation from Christine Pavlik, the city's Housing and Grants Administrator. Christine, feel free to take over.
Thank you so much, Chair Denham. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Make sure everybody can see that okay. See. Okay. So it is a pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? I feel like I'm getting a little feedback.
I can hear you fine. Is anyone else having issues?
Okay, Christine.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So good evening, or good afternoon, actually, Housing Commissioners. It's great to see you all again. For those of you who don't know, I'm Christine Pavlik. I'm the Housing and Grants Administrator for the City Housing Section. Today we're going to chat about the American Rescue Plan Act Coronavirus Local Fiscal Recovery Funds that were designated for housing assistance projects and programs, as well as the Community Development Block Grant Program Year 2023 funding recommendations. So first I'll just do a little background on ARPA, and we'll talk about the ARPA recommendations, then we'll move on to the CDBG recommendations. That way we're not mixing it up too much. So the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 created what most call SLFRF, Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. We've just been calling them local recovery funds. It created this program and delivered $350 billion for states, territories, municipalities, counties, tribal governments. And the key objectives for the local recovery funds that guide its use by municipalities are to support the urgent COVID-19 response efforts, to continue to decrease spread of the virus and bring the pandemic under control. And that's really what we used a lot of our funds for when we first received them back in 2021 and 2022. Then they could also be used to replace lost revenue for eligible recipients, to strengthen support for vital public services and help retain jobs. And council did determine to use a large chunk of our ARPA funding for that purpose as well. Next, support an equitable recovery through immediate economic stabilization for households and businesses, and then address systemic public health and economic challenges that have contributed to the unequal impact of the pandemic on certain populations. And that is really where the housing assistance funds fit in, are those last two items. So discussions regarding these allocation amounts for ARPA and what categories were held between council on September 7th, 2021 and October 12th, 2021 at those council meetings. And then City Council provided final direction on the use of funding on October 12th. And so you can see here what all of the allocations were, but you can see on the left side here what the housing section is responsible for administering. So that includes $400,000 to congregate care facilities, $1.9 million in housing assistance, and then $300,000 in aid to victim services. So at this time, we have allocated the congregate care funds. What we're discussing today are the funds for housing assistance, and next in the coming months, we'll be doing the funds for victim services organizations. So just to give you a rundown on where we're at with those congregate care funds, the housing section allocated funds under this category through both a notice of funding availability and application, and then through 2 emergency allocations. So essentially, when we were in the midst of having these funds allocated, it became clear that we really needed to get these out to some of our shelters as quickly as possible. They were in need. They were still recovering from the pandemic, if not still really in the midst of it, with having lots of staff and clients that they needed to protect. So we did provide $100,000 for payroll and motel fees to Flagstaff Shelter Services under an emergency basis, and then a little over $75,000 to Northland Family Help Center. Through our NOFA, we did an additional allocation of program dollars to Flagstaff Shelter Services and funds for HVAC and other improvements at shelter and group home sites for Catholic Charities. So at this time, all of the operational funding has been expended, and we are just working with Northland Family Help Center and Catholic Charities to finish up the physical improvements at each of their sites, but all of the operational dollars have been spent down. So Flagstaff City Council directed that $1.9 million in local recovery funds be applied to housing assistance projects and programs, and these need to improve community resilience, address disparities of disproportionately impacted communities, and create and preserve stable, affordable housing, as well as prevent eviction. So the purpose of all of these programs, services, and capital expenditures must be to both respond to the negative economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, as especially by helping households recover from economic impacts. And they particularly want municipalities to focus on assisting disproportionately impacted populations, so low-income workers, people of color, hardest hit folks from the pandemic. And so some of the projects that were outlined and could include, but the funds weren't limited to just these projects, were things like affordable rental housing production and preservation, affordable housing rehab, expanded home ownership investments to build new affordable home ownership, capital repairs, improvements, and redevelopment for long-term preservation. So large projects for preserving affordable housing, acquisition funds, just any investment in supportive housing that can be programmatic. It can be acquisition of hotels or motels, counseling and legal aid services, and then tenant outreach and assistance. So again, they didn't have to stick within those categories, but those were kind of the guiding projects that were provided by the U.S. Treasury, who is administering these funds. So the beneficiaries for this funding are households that can receive or benefit from assistance based on the impacts of the pandemic that they experienced. So the Treasury left this quite vague because I think they understood that this is different for every community. And I think it really benefited the city of Flagstaff because we were able to support the idea that, while yes, our 60% AMI households and below were absolutely impacted, in the city of Flagstaff, we see that our 80% and even 100% AMI households are also disproportionately impacted. Whereas I think in other communities where housing is not quite so unaffordable, those folks would not be considered disproportionately impacted. So we were able to define our beneficiaries this way so that the projects that we received would be designed to serve these beneficiaries. So we also did ask in applications for our applicants to explain how they will address disproportionate impact in other ways on not just low-income households, but people of color, people with disabilities, immigrant communities, LGBTQ populations, and really any historically marginalized groups. We also use the 10-year housing plan as a guide for funding. We asked that applicants describe how their projects will help the city meet the identified overarching goal of our plan to reduce the current affordable housing need in our community, either through the impact of low and moderate income residents through unit creation or subsidies, or the creation or preservation of housing units. We had other criteria for evaluation, kind of just general. Does it fit in the scope of housing assistance? Is the project feasible, or do we have concern with timelines? These are sunset funds. We have asked that they be spent down by the end of 2024. There's a little wiggle room with the U.S. Treasury after that, but these are not here forever. So we wanted to make sure that the project was feasible, that the project, that there was equity in the project, that it meets goals and actually serves those disproportionately impacted populations. And then what kind of community leverage and partnerships are coming in? Did the applicant provide support from other organizations doing similar work for their project? And then what's the long-term value and impact? We really wanted to make sure that, you know, these one-time funds created a permanent benefit in our community. Some additional criteria was participation with the continuum of care, demonstration of local community need and evidence-based interventions, as well as just the applicant's capacity to administer federal funding. So on this side, you can see the proposals that we received. The NOFA was released in November, and applications were due back to the city in mid-December. We received slightly over, you can see that they were, the funds requested were in excess of the funds available for allocation. So we have 1.9 million and we received requests totaling over 2.1 million. Just to give you a little rundown of each of these, Catholic Charities asked for funding to support their homeless outreach and support services programs. These are primarily focused on folks with serious mental illnesses, but they can also serve folks coming through their front door for rehousing, rapid rehousing services as well. DNA People's Legal Services asked for funds to provide outreach about their services and their educational programs citywide, as well as to provide legal aid to 85 households preventing eviction. Flagstaff Shelter Services asked for funds for their new hotel for operations for additional staff. Habitat for Humanity requested funds for pre-development, so site work at a site in Timber Sky where they hope to eventually develop 24 sites. But the idea was that the site work would allow them to build 6 of those sites, 6 homes on those sites within the first year. Homeless Youth Connection asked for funds they were able to recently purchase a house for transitional housing and emergency shelter for youth. This is specifically filling that gap of over 18 that Northland Family Help Center can't take teens over 18, but these youth are still in high school. They're still pursuing their diploma. So a standard shelter is maybe not the best option for them. So this is emergency household or emergency shelter and housing for like 18 to 21-year-olds pursuing their diploma. So they asked for operational support. Housing Solutions asked for funding for their 44 transitional housing units, JoJo's Place. It's currently under construction. They were able to purchase an old hotel with funds from the state, the Arizona Department of Housing through CDBG-CV, and they have incurred lots of change orders and costs in excess of what they had expected when they first purchased that development. And so they've requested $500,000 to help fill that gap. The Salvation Army asked for funds for rental assistance, rental vouchers, and then case management. And Vias on Lake Mary is a LIHTC development. 76 units are planned, and they requested a $500,000 loan for construction. So on this slide, you can see the ranking committee's recommendations. The score provided here is an average of all of the ranking committee members' scores. After discussion, the committee really felt that because the scores were so close for those last 3 applications, that it would be best to provide partial funding to each of them at 80% of their request, rather than max out the first one, use the remaining funds for the second one, and provide no funding for the last one. Their scores were within, I think Habitat for Humanity's was 1.6 or 164.4. So it was really close. So the recommendation is to provide full funding to Housing Solutions, DNA People's Legal, Flagstaff Shelter Services, Homeless Youth Connections, and Catholic Charities. To provide partial funding to Vias on Lake Mary, structured as a 20-year loan that they will pay back to the city, that will then be program income that will be unrestricted for the city housing section to use for future projects. Then providing Habitat for Humanity partial funding and the Salvation Army partial funding as well. So those are the ranking committee's recommendations. And if anybody has any questions specifically about these ARPA recommendations, I'm happy to answer them right now.
I do have a question to start us off, Christine.
Sure.
I'm curious, do you know what criteria was responsible for the last 3 options being ranked lower than the other ones? Was it particularly low scores on a particular criteria, or were they just sort of lower across the board? Some detail is appreciated.
Absolutely, yeah. So the major concerns about both, so first for Vias on Lake Mary, the biggest concern was that the application lacked a lot of information about local community need and community partnerships. I think because they're a developer, they're not located here in Flagstaff. They're not providing services on a daily basis. Now they will hire a property management company that will provide those services, and they did provide some info about that, but the application just lacked the support needed to give points for some of that community collaboration. As far as Habitat for Humanity, the major concern was timely spin down. The project has not started I think it's called the development process, the site plan approval process. None of that has been started yet. And so there were a lot of concerns from the ranking committee about the ability to spin down these funds, as well as identify the other funds needed for this large project. I think there was also concern because Habitat for Humanity has not administered federal funding in the past. And then for Salvation Army, additionally, I think they were in the same boat, kind of there. They haven't had a ton of experience administering federal funds. I think with CDBG, that concern's even higher because CDBG comes with a lot of, especially for development, federal labor requirements, whereas ARPA will not have Davis-Bacon and federal labor requirements. So it felt like it was a little, like it's a great way to introduce them to federal funding mechanisms, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. And I have another question, but I want to give space for the other commission members to ask any questions they may have. We can circle back around to my second one. All right, I'll count that as a long enough pause. Second question I had is, what does an 80%, the 20% reduction in the funding they asked for, what is the impact of that? For example, on the LIHTC development, their proposal was 221 LIHTC units. Does that mean only 80% of those units get built, or are they likely to be able to get the remaining funds from some other source? Like, does that scuttle the whole project or reduce the number? Or what's the impact?
That's a great question. So specifically for that one, the LIHTC project that requested fund for CDBG was 221, which is where you got that figure. The VIAs on Lake Mary is 76 units. But to answer your question, they will still be able to develop the 76 unit LIHTC development. They will just need to identify other funds to fill their gap. I know they're pursuing funds through the city of Flagstaff. They're also pursuing funds through the Housing Trust Fund through ADO. They continue to try and find those. But they did state in their application that that they would accept any amount of funding. They were not going to be able to use the funds because they were less. As far as Habitat for Humanity goes, in their application, they stated that if they received less than full funding, they may not be able to prepare as many sites. So they had initially said that they would prepare 24 of the 48 sites that they have planned for the long term. So this would allow them to maybe do less than 24 depending on fundraising efforts, but that they will still move forward with the work and use these funds for pre-development. It may also mean that they can't build all 6 homes within the first year. They may need to build fewer homes depending on how the funding works for site development. And then the Salvation Army will just serve fewer households. So I can't remember exactly how many they said they were going to serve from the, I guess I could go back a slide if I was clicked on here. 50 households. So I think that that would reduce them down to about 35 households.
Understood. Yeah, thank you for that explanation. And just to prompt a bit more conversation from the other commission members, I'm going to assume silence is sort of agreement with the recommendations the ranking committee made. Before we move on to the next section, is there anyone who has any questions or doubts or would have preferred different rankings? Moses, yes, I see you have a question.
Yeah, it's actually a question for you, Tyler, I think. I wasn't aware that the commissioners really had any say in the rankings and the decision for funding. Am I incorrect in that?
Oh, so at the end of this, we'll have a motion either to forward the recommendations to City Council, saying, hey, we agree with these, we think you should approve them. Or if we don't agree with them, we think they should be different, we would make a motion saying, hey, we don't agree with these recommendations from the ranking committee. We think the allocation should actually be like this. And Adriana, correct me if I'm wrong there.
Here I am. Tyler, you're right. We're basically just requesting for an agreement with the recommendation and an approval to recommend to council for approval. Essentially. So you guys can give your own feedback and we can include it in council's presentation.
And I see that Commissioner Haley has a comment, and then after her, Adra has his hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to also remind all of the commissioners on this that usually Christine is looking for participants and helping rank these applications. So if anybody ever does want to be more involved and actually see the applications, usually there's an opportunity for us to do that. So I had a personal emergency, but I got to review a few of these applications. So just wanted to throw my comment out there that I think definitely these are appropriate recommendations.
Thank you so much, Haley.
Hey, I know, sorry, I got in here a couple minutes late, had a student. But as far as like, how, I guess, how do you assemble that committee that did the rankings? Is it just open to anybody? Is it like a public call? How is that done?
That's a great question. So we have, ever since the creation of the Housing Commission, we have asked for volunteers from the commission to be on the ranking committee. It also includes internal staff members who have an expertise in finance or project management, grant management. And then we also have a few community members that are considered experts in one of those things as well. So finance or social services, grant management. These scores are based on not just the project being meeting a local community need and meeting the guidelines of the grant, but also based on a risk assessment. So it's great to have folks that are that specialize in finance and things like that, because they can say, oh, I have big concerns about this organization's funding being tied up in non-liquid, I'm not a finance person, but to be able to give that feedback. Thank you. I did okay. So that we can kind of incorporate that in that risk assessment as well. So yes, we're always looking for volunteers from the Housing Commission. I'm having a blank for some reason as to if we didn't have a representative from the a League of Neighborhoods for this ranking committee, but we typically do have one for our CDBG committee every year.
And like I said, I didn't see everything on here. Was there a list of who's on the committee?
There's not.
We
try to keep
presentation.
Yeah, that's a great question. We try to keep that kind of like off the public record. We don't want folks to be reaching out to them independently. We really want it to be a committee-wide recommendation, if that makes sense.
How many people are on the committee?
I believe we had 5 for this committee, and we had 6 for our CDBG committee. Typically, we try to do 5 to 7.
How many of those 5 like work for the city or housing?
Yeah, so 3 this year. It varies every time, but 3 to 4.
3 to 4, and then the other 2 you said are experts in some sort of housing,
or housing commissioners. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and I see that Commissioner Rebecca raised her hand, and then after that, Jackie raised her hand. So in that order.
Oh, I took my hand down. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. In that case, Jackie.
I don't know if I'm not paying attention. The villas on Lake Mary, what is that? Are these emergency funds? What is this development? How are they? What factor do they contribute to emergency housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these funds are not just for emergency housing. They can be for any sort of affordable housing development. And a LIHTC is a low income housing tax credit development. So they are able to create usually apartment complexes that are entirely low
scale
income households. And so they're just asking for funding for some of the gaps that they've endured because of inflation and just kind of the way that the economy has been. They're facing higher costs than they were expecting. And so they're seeking funding from not just us, but the state as well to kind of fill that gap.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
And these are definitely low income housing units. It's not going to be like the Alara where they promise all these low income housing units, and I'm not even sure if they've been built yet at Alara. And
Correct,
that was
yeah. So this isn't like a development agreement with the city. This is a state program, and so they are required to provide 76 units at 60% AMI for 30 years. So definitely the best definition of affordable housing.
That answers my question. Thank you,
Great.
Christine.
No problem.
Any other questions from commissioners or any comments on whether you think the rankings from the committee are appropriate?
Tyler, this is Sean. I have a quick question. Christine, one of the criteria I think was around long-term benefit or long-term effect of these funds. So for the couple there that are operational funds, were those scored differently because they're going to operational funds and not necessarily like to a building that creates more permanent solution, I guess?
That's a great question. So both of the, so I'll start with Homeless Youth Connection. So their transitional housing, it really does create a long-term impact because the operational funds allow them to continue to turn these shelter beds over. Transitional housing can be up to 2 years. And so it really allows folks the time to gain the stability that they need in order to be able to successfully obtain. And sometimes it's not even a different subsidized housing unit. Sometimes it's market rate that they're ready to move into market rate housing after that transitional housing time. So we still saw that as the development of units. These transitional housing places cannot create units without the operational dollars. As far as the Flagstaff Shelter Services hotel shelter operations goes, they will be converting that hotel into permanent supportive housing after they are transitional housing for the next 5 years. So they do have a long-term benefit beyond just the emergency shelter.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if that is it for questions, I'm happy to move on to CDBG, but I'll let you ask one more time, Chair Denham.
Yeah, we can definitely circle back around if anyone thinks of a question later. But for now, we can move on to the next section, the CDBG funding.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the CDBG annual action plan. And I think most of you were here when I came and kind of gave a general overview of the annual action plan process for CDBG. So our document is due on May 15th to let HUD know what our intentions are with the funds through our annual action plan. And we will be going to council April 25th to provide the recommendations that you've approved and to ask them for a resolution allowing us to submit that annual action plan to HUD. So, so you'll remember that CDBG has national objectives, and so any of these applications, these projects, are only eligible if they qualify as either a limited clientele serving low-income persons or those presumed to be low income, a housing activity, an area benefit to a target neighborhood, so a predominantly low-income neighborhood, or a job creation or retention activity. And council, every 2 years when we have new council, we have them set priorities for the next 2 years, and they did set priorities for housing, both rental and ownership, homelessness, neighborhood revitalization, and workforce job training. And typically, if a project fits under any of those, they will get an additional 10 points. However, this year, I think they wanted to make sure there was an emphasis on housing. And so we did 10 points for housing and homelessness projects and 5 additional points for neighborhood revitalization and workforce job training projects. So in addition to council's priorities and national objectives, every 5 years, we create our consolidated plan. This also guides our funding. And so in the application, applicants are asked to demonstrate how their project will help us meet the goals identified in the consolidated plan. So you can see here we have revitalization in public facilities, public services, addressing homelessness, and providing decent, affordable housing with our 5-year goal to the right. We also do extensive public participation with CDBG, a little hampered by the snow this year. I think we had lower attendance because of that. But we did have an event in September with for our target neighborhoods in partnership with a league of neighborhoods. That's Sunnyside, La Plaza Vieja, South Side, and Pine Knoll Brannan. And so we had all of our city departments there to answer questions about how projects are picked, how projects are funded, and also receive feedback from those neighborhoods about what they see as needs in their communities. We had another meeting on March 2nd, where we reviewed the applications that came in, and we specifically asked for target neighborhood residents to provide feedback. So we received the notice of, or we released the notice of funding availability for CDBG on February 1st. They were due back to the city March 1st, And then we hosted a meeting reviewing those applications on March 2nd. And by reviewing, I just mean letting the community know what the requests were and for what projects. Then the ranking committee met yesterday, actually, and discussed the applications in depth and formulated final funding recommendations to bring to you today, March 23rd, Housing Commission. And then, like I said, we'll meet with City Council April 25th and May 2nd. So usually we have to base things on an estimate, but HUD this year is on it, and they provided our entitlement allocation ahead. It's slightly more, about $10,000 more than last year at $541,191. And then we have program income. I'll just remind folks that program income is funds that were, when we do a housing rehab project or when we provide down payment assistance through CDBG programs, those loans are secured as a second loan that's paid when someone sells their home, when they pull cash out through a refinance, or they no longer live there. And so these are funds that have come in from those loans being paid off. So we're able to use that to reallocate to the community. And then reallocated funds are projects that didn't use all of the funding that they were allocated, or projects that needed to be canceled because they just didn't pan out. I think during the pandemic, especially, some of our nonprofits have faced a lot of hardships. And so we did have one project that didn't pan out. And so we're going to be reallocating those funds this year. So we have a little over $740,000 to allocate. And these are the requests we received. So we had one internal request for La Plaza Vieja Phase 2. What this is a neighborhood revitalization infrastructure improvement project in La Plaza Vieja, doing some repairs to sidewalks, creating a safer crosswalk, and adding in some better drainage on that street. We do not rank internal applications because we know, as the city of Flagstaff, we have the capacity to carry out these projects. So typically we take them to council as is without a ranking. Housing Solutions requested funds for the acquisition of 3 affordable rental units, 2 studios and a 1-bedroom. This would serve approximately 13 households over 10 years, depending on occupancy timelines. And so each of those units, they would use $125,000 for each unit as a down payment to make their mortgage affordable so that they can offer these as permanently affordable rentals. Flagstaff Shelter Services asked for $245,000. They are in the process of purchasing a hotel they're going to call it the Lantern. They'll have 103 units, and the funds they requested were to install kitchenettes in every unit. So the funds would cover the actual kitchenettes as well as installation. And then they would use other funds to pay for shipping and some additional contingency for installation. Northland Family Help Center requested funds in order to improve their parking lot and their roof. These haven't been redone in over 20 years, and they are desperately needed in order to keep their shelter fit and safe for their residents. And then Roars Flagstaff Apartments has requested $600,000 for acquisition of land at what's currently Timber Sky. They would like to have assistance for those acquisition costs, and then they will be doing a light tech development, 221 units. CDBG cannot be used for construction costs of new housing unless it's done by a community housing development organization. So they're only eligible to ask for CDBG funds for acquisition of land. And then for under our public service category, if you'll remember, we can only use 15% of our funds from CDBG for operations. So we had 2 requests come in, one from Housing Solutions of Northern Arizona for operating support at JoJo's Place. Because these are going to be transitional housing units for the next 5 years, they are going to need to have a property manager as well as case management for their residents. And then Community Action Teams of Flagstaff, CATS of Flagstaff, requested operational support to create a new position that will allow their mobile shower and outreach bus to go from operating 4 days a week to 5 days a week. So as you can see, we had a lot more funding requested than we have available to pin out. So that's where the ranking committee comes in. So we had a conversation with the capital improvements department here at the city about their La Plaza Vieja request. I'm just going to go back so you can see that it was $700,000. So typically when the city funds internal projects, CDBG is used as a gap or a way to fill a gap. And it's not something that we don't usually use our entire allocation on one project. Now that could still be done, but because we have such little funding, it was kind of agreed between capital that it's best to have this project pulled and for now and set aside for perhaps next year they can come back and request partial funding if they're able to identify a grant or other general funds that can be used to make up that difference. We also need to make sure that we are meeting our timeliness requirements through HUD. And when you have all your money in one, all your eggs in one basket, and that basket hits any sort of timeliness or rollout concerns, then you can really get into a pickle. So we like to diversify our portfolio, if you will. So these are our recommendations after the internal application is not on here because it was withdrawn. So you can see that under the public services, JoJo's Place scored the highest of all of the applications, and they were recommended for full funding. However, because of that 15%, we can only fund up to $98,000. And so the recommendation of the ranking committee was to fully fund the max allowable for public services for operating support at JoJo's Place. The mobile shower and outreach bus application, the committee really felt that there were concerns about agency capacity. This is a brand new nonprofit. And so because the score was so different, they felt fully funding the higher ranking application was more appropriate. As far as the housing, public facility, and infrastructure category that you see on top there, the highest ranking application was Northland Family Help Center. So they were recommended for full funding. And then as opposed to fully funding Housing Solutions and not funding Flagstaff Shelter Services, because their scores were so close, the ranking committee decided that they would prefer to partially fund Housing Solutions and Flagstaff Shelter Services. So the applications did provide information about how the projects could proceed with just partial funding. So Housing Solutions had asked for $125,000 for each unit, and so they can purchase 2 out of the 3 with this partial allocation of $250,000. And then Flagstaff Shelter Services, while they use the hotel as a shelter, they're not required to provide kitchens. While that is a great enhancement for these units, it's not required until they convert these to permanent supportive housing in 5 years. So the ranking committee felt that it was appropriate to provide partial funding to Flagstaff Shelter Services so that they can start that process of installing kitchenettes, and it'll probably be about less than half of the 103 units. And then both organizations can absolutely request funding through next year's CDBG process if they desire for the remaining units or remaining funds for these projects. So yeah, if anybody has any questions about these, I am available to ask. And if you have questions about ARPA as well, please do ask.
Thank you for that, Christine. And just to reiterate from earlier, what we're looking for is, well, also if you have any questions, ask those. But at the end of this, we're going to make a motion to either say we agree with the recommendations that came from the ranking committee, or we disagree and we think they should be different in some way. And that will then go on to City Council for approval. So keep that in mind. If something looks strange here, or you think more money should have gone to something different, now is the time to speak up.
And I should probably give a little background on the LIHTC development. I completely forgot to mention that. So as you can see, their application scored quite low and they had a very large ask. So some of the reasons their application scored low is that there was really no transparency in their budget as to what their gap was, what other funding they were using for acquisition, and there was almost no information provided about what the long-term project would look like, as well as the funding for that long-term project. So I think there were a lot of concerns about that. The application also lacked support from community organizations. And again, I think that's that difference between a developer versus a nonprofit that's located in town and is already working within our continuum of care. Applications get additional points for being a part of the continuum of care in the front door. And then because it was such a large ask, I think that partial funding really didn't feel like it would be impactful. Well, it was hard for us to know if it would be impactful because we could not see what their gap was. There was no budget provided. And so just to give a little information about why that one was not recommended for funding.
And out of curiosity, how would a LIHTC developer integrate themselves with the housing continuum of care in order to avoid systematically getting lower scores?
That's a good question. You know, I think that it just comes down to the cities and council's priorities for the use of CDBG funds, and we have always prioritized funding local organizations. Go ahead, Sarah. You probably have a much better answer for that question.
Thank you for that. LIHTC development actually within the qualified allocation plan, which is the document that governs the competitive process, there are actually points for partnering with local nonprofits within a community. And so we have seen LIHTC developers from outside the community come in and actually partner with, for example, Star Point, which is the one that's been under construction out towards Seacrest School, is partnered with Housing Solutions of Northern Arizona to make sure that that local element is introduced and some of those connections are made. So there are actually tools provided within the program itself to encourage those connections and to also display their importance.
Okay, so it's not set in stone that a LIHTC developer is always going to get a lower score because of that lack of community engagement. There are ways for them to meet that criteria.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Moses has a comment. Feel free to go. Feel free to speak.
Thanks, Tyler. I have two comments. First, I don't think I can vote on either of these since I'm on the board of both the Housing Solutions and on the Flagstaff Shelter Services. So I will be not voting on the motions. But I did want to say I'm a little bit disappointed that the Cats of Flagstaff was recommended for $0 of funding. I think that's an innovative, new, interesting approach to helping our community and public service. So I was a little bit disappointed to see the $0 recommendation. And it's just a comment. You don't need to defend the committee's recommendations or anything like that.
Thank you.
Are there any other commissioners that have any comments or issues with the allocation the ranking committee recommended? Okay. In that case, I am going to make a motion, and Adriana, correct me if I say this wrong. I'm going to do my best. I have a motion to forward the ranking committee's recommendations for ARPA and CDBG funding allocations to City Council with a recommendation for approval. And just to justify why I'm making that motion, I didn't hear much disagreement with the recommendations as we were going through. I heard questions, but I didn't hear much hard disagreement. So I'm going to make that motion and put that out there.
Do you need a second to that motion?
I will need a second.
I second that motion.
All right, I have a motion by myself, a second by Commissioner Rebecca. Is there any discussion? All right, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed, nay. All right, it appears that that motion passes.
I'm sorry, Tyler.
And
could you-
Adriana, I want to check with Moises's thing. How do we? Oh, Moises, I think you're about to ask the same thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you just mark me down as abstain?
Yeah, I was going to ask Adriana, how do we register that Moses abstained from the vote? Do we need to do anything specific? Or do you already
Nope,
have it in the minutes?
we'll just make sure that we note it in the notes and you'll see it next time. So we're good to go.
All right. Yeah, again, Christine, thank you so much for that presentation, walking us through that. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll all be back next year to bug you guys about volunteering for our ranking committee. So keep it in the back of your mind. Thanks.
Yeah, look forward to it. All
Christine.
right. Yes. I heard someone speak up. Was that you, Adriana?
I just said thanks, Christine. That's probably what you heard.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Agree. I second that. Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, now on to general business. Wait, no, sorry. There are no general business items today. So we skip on to informational items, starting with agenda item 8A, an update from the Housing Authority Commission member. Moses, that's you. Do you have any updates for us?
I do not, because the March 16 Housing Authority Commission meeting was canceled.
Gotcha. Quorum issues, or was it the snow? I'm curious to know.
There was lack of business, I believe, was the reason.
Okay. Understood. All right, moving on to agenda item 8B, updates from housing commissioners and other informational items. I do have an update to give, but I want to ask the other commissioners if they have any updates first. All right. So my update, Adriana, this is kind of focused towards you. I am holding a webinar on parking reform with Buffalo's senior planner. Buffalo famously got rid of its parking mandates in order to improve housing affordability back in 2017. And as its senior planner, he's been able to see the real world effects for like 6 years. I distributed that invite for the webinar pretty widely, and it's probably going to come around to a couple of the commissioners here. Are there any issues, Adriana, with commissioners here attending that webinar I'm hosting?
There are no issues. Tyler, that's a great question. So we'll do it kind of the same way we did it as the last webinar you hosted, where individuals can go, but it's up to each commissioner to ensure that open meeting law is not broken. Because that's, again, I just want to remind everybody that that's a personal liability. So as long as we don't talk about housing commission topics, I think we should be good to go.
Okay, and in order to be very safe, does that mean if a commissioner from here attends that webinar I'm hosting, basically as long as we don't directly interact, like they're not asking me questions and me responding to them, that should be fine?
You could talk about the weather, you could talk about anything that is not housing commission business related, and you're good to go. It's not necessarily not interacting, it's whether you talk about housing commission business at this specific meeting.
Okay, because one of the things I am going to talk about is the impact of parking mandates on housing. And Moses has a comment, and then Sarah has her hand raised. So in that order.
Yes, Tyler, I was going to say, clearly a lot of this conversation is going to be about business that the Housing Commission has some interest in. So I would be super careful. I won't be there in part because of that, but also because of timing. But I would be super careful not to have too many Housing Commission members there. You don't want to be in violation of that law.
Okay, and Sarah?
I wanted to clarify that the danger comes with having a majority of the housing commission there talking about housing commission topics. So if it's one or two and you happen to discuss parking's impact on housing, that's fine. But if you get anywhere near a quorum, that's where, in the case of city council, if that happens and it's not posted as a public meeting, a member of the council will self-select to depart so that there isn't a majority there. So we're not in trouble with the omelet, which is the open meeting law enforcement team with the Attorney General's office, or just be very, very careful to avoid those pieces. I would hate to have to spend any time or anybody's personal liability wrapped up in issues surrounding open meeting law.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll say in summary, if anyone does see that invite and is interested but is concerned about this, I will be posting the recording of the webinar around. So if you are interested, you can easily watch it later at your own convenience. All right. Any other updates from other commissioners? I'll give one more chance to speak up. All right. In that case, we move on to agenda item 8C, updates from housing staff. Staff, do you have any updates?
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jennifer Michelson, a housing analyst here with the housing section. I think it's been a couple months since I've given any updates, so I have kind of an older one Adriana reminded me of today. I just wanted the commission to be fully aware that we sold the first Habitat for Humanity starter home that was built on a city property on O'Leary Street downtown. That house sold in early February. And so we were pretty excited about that accomplishment. We have one more starter home that will be built on that site. So that's another thing to look forward to in the coming months. They haven't started construction because of this terrible weather, but I'm thinking they'll jump on that right when things start to clear up. So second starter home on the way. This week, another fun piece of information. This Tuesday, City Council approved a standby loan for the Foundation for Senior Living. That's a low-income housing tax credit developer. They requested local gap funding from the city as part of their 2023 tax credit application. They're going in for tax credits for their San Francisco Square apartments downtown. I'm not sure if this group has heard of that project. It's been around for a couple of years. They have site plan approval and everything. They've just had a hard time with getting the right amount of funding at the right time. So they're going in this year for this round of tax credits. Fingers crossed they're successful, and hopefully standby loan commitment will be helpful for them in securing more points for their application. So we would know, we can share with the commission this summer if they do get funding, they would know by June. So that's another really exciting prospect for 100% affordable project. It would also be for seniors. So along the same light tech news, we just heard today or yesterday about from Brinshore Development Partners. They're a low-income housing tax credit developer. They will be hosting like a grand opening celebration for their new apartment complex, Star Point. It's that big complex that just went up on Fort Valley Road. So they've also, that was a tough one during the pandemic, getting all of their delays figured out and construction cost increases figured out. So we're really excited to have that project open and available for leases for people. So they did invite council and the mayor to that grand opening. I don't have an exact date for the group. It will be toward the end of April. So I can have Adriana forward that official meeting date and invitation and everything over email to you guys, just so you're aware. And that's all I had. Was that everything, Adriana? I was trying to think of all these things. I think that's about it.
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that update. Some good news, it sounds like. And if there are no more updates from staff, Councilmember Kara has a question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, I just had a quick question for staff because I was just reading an article that came out a couple days ago about a development that's coming to Glendale that's taking advantage of, it's basically Arizona's first ever state low income housing tax credit development. It's going to be bringing something like almost 400 units to that community. And I'm just wondering what it takes to bring that sort of development or funding to a community like Flagstaff. Just because it seems like it's a new opportunity and potentially something that we could look at as a city. That's it. Sarah, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I'll take that one. It's so exciting to see the state housing tax credit program operating. It's brand new. This is one of the first, that's why it's such a big deal in Glendale, is this is one of the first actual projects to utilize this funding source in such a large scale way. It's not something we as a community drive, of the tax credit process through the state, as well as the one through the feds that we've been talking about for several items today, are driven by developers. We can potentially assist in partnerships, like you heard about the small but significant standby loan for Foundation for Senior Living. We in the past have partnered on some land options, that type of thing. Those things are largely driven by the private development market, because it is the private developers that are most eligible for LIHTC funding. One of the required pieces to be successful in a LIHTC application is previous development experience. And we as a municipality are not a developer, although we don't even play one on TV, but we do seek partnerships with folks. And in fact, our phone's been ringing a little bit off the hook. Jen, if she was on camera, would be shaking her head like this, as we see increased, she's smiling and nodding like yes, because when we get these requests, we forward them to Jen. And so with requests from developers, talking about coming to our community, which we meet with them. We have multiples a year. They're often seeking land, and they want to talk about where. One of the reasons we're a desirable community for any type of LIHTC development, whether it be the state or federal program, is because we are in what's called a difficult development area, or a DDA, where it's acknowledged that our development costs are a little bit more. So sometimes it's easier to make the projects pencil. But what we're seeing lately with the realities of the construction market and the materials pricing is even that is not necessarily cracking that necessary nut for that LIHTC development. Thus, some of the applications you saw for both CDBG and for ARPA funding. So we are working on bringing developers to town at any possibility we can. When we attend our state conferences, they are well attended by tax credit developers as well. Flagstaff has had some challenges in the past multiple years because of the way the competitive documents through the state are written, and that a developer could only have one project. And the ones in Flagstaff, given some of our development limitations, are not as lucrative as in the other large urban areas. And so we've seen developers switch to really focusing on applications in the Phoenix and Tucson area. However, we were successful in working with the Department of Housing to, I don't remember if we were able to get it entirely eliminated or just softened, that it is not, you can only have one tax credit allocation in a year, but you can have one urban and one rural. And under the state, we are classified as rural. Rural in Arizona is anything outside of Pima and Maricopa counties. And so, in fact, really exciting, we just had a request come in probably yesterday, could have been the day before, for a local developer looking to meet with staff to talk about some different affordable housing financing options. So thanks for the question. I hope that helped.
And I think Jackie has a follow-up question. Her hand is up.
I actually just wanted to make a comment to what Sarah just said. That funding is limited by zip code, and we only have 3 zip codes. We actually had this discussion at my government affairs meeting last month, I'm sorry. And that does hinder us from getting some of those projects because we're limited every year on how many we are allowed to do, just based strictly on zip code alone. Because like you said, there's one area, you can have one in each area or whatever, and we're just limited in general as far as that goes. So if that
Thank you,
matters.
Jackie. We actually have been working quite closely with the State Department of Housing. The woman who is now in charge of the LIHTC process for the state used to be an intern here with us at the city of Flagstaff in housing. And so we kind of have a different opening where we sit down and we catch up with each other, and at the same time we're like, hey, remember, but we also, and this is Jennifer's work, I dare not take credit for her very hard work of staying on top of that qualified allocation plan competitive document and offering written comments as part of the public processes, as well as our informal advocacy on the backside as well, of like, remember, our issues are a little different than the rest of the state. So we take advantage of both the formal opportunities to make those comments and the informal opportunities to remind people of them.
Yeah, I'll just add that yeah, Jackie, that zip code chart that ended up in the final document, that was new to my knowledge. That was new this year. Or I suppose they used one plan for the years of 2022 and 2023. But I was made aware of it, and once it was kind of the final draft in like November and October kind of time. So it's frustrating. They did identify it as, more severely underserved zip codes. So I don't know if they were looking at zip codes where they have literally no LIHTC projects or what that threshold was. I mean, of course, there's, areas in the state that don't have any LIHTC projects at all. We're obviously always supportive of as many as we could possibly ever get. So yeah, we can try to advocate for a different sort of set of zip codes, or maybe they'll take it out next year. Who knows? It's like such an evolving document. It's interesting to see how they kind of rework it each year based on need and what they're hearing from developers, what they're hearing from, balance of state areas and that kind of a thing. So it's never set in stone forever, which is good.
Wait, is that really right that they're doing that on a zip code level? Because that's odd to me. I mean, LIHTC developments are likely geographically concentrated because Arizona's population is geographically concentrated. I would expect LIHTCs to mostly show up in a few zip codes, and I wouldn't want to knock them for that. But yeah, we're getting off topic, I'm afraid. I feel like I can sense Adriana about to jump in.
I love that you knew that.
Yes. But thank you so much for that update, and Jackie for the additional context. Yeah, really interesting to hear. If there's not any other updates or questions from anyone, and I'll leave like a 10-second pause there for someone to jump in. All right, then we'll go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you everyone so much for your time. This meeting is adjourned at 2:10 p.m. Everyone have a good rest of your day.